And people see that with Eamonn and I on TV, you know. So I say, well, we don't row, actually. And people say, oh, they argue. I say, we don't. It's just I don't always agree with him. And just because he's my husband, I'll never always agree with him. And I can't be that person that doesn't voice that opinion.
There are marriages that end quietly, slipping away like a tide that nobody notices until the shore is bare. And then there are marriages that end like a crack of thunder in a clear sky, sudden, disorienting, leaving everyone around them wondering how they missed the storm that was gathering. Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford belonged to the second kind. 4 years, they were the couple that British breakfast television held up as its gold standard. Two people who seemed genuinely built for each other, who laughed easily together on camera and appeared to carry that warmth into the rest of their lives. When their divorce was announced in May 2023, the public reaction was not just surprise. It was something closer to disbelief. These two, if they could not make it work, what hope was there for anyone? But here is what the public did not know, and what Eamonn Holmes has slowly begun to reveal in the time since the split became official. The marriage that looked so solid from the outside had been quietly fracturing for years. The smiles were real once, the connection genuine, but somewhere along the way, something fundamental shifted, and by the time either of them was willing to name it, the damage had already been done. The story of how this marriage ended is not a simple one. It is not a story about a villain and a victim. It is something far more complicated and far more human than that. It is a story about power, about illness, about the slow erosion of identity that can happen inside even the most loving relationships, and about what it costs a person to stay silent while the world makes up its mind about who they are. Eamonn Holmes spent a long time saying nothing. In the immediate aftermath of the divorce announcement, Ruth Langsford was the one who shaped the early narrative. She did not do it through dramatic revelations or tearful confessions. She did it the way composed, media-savvy people always do, through carefully placed words, through the dignified public image she had spent decades carefully cultivating, through friends who spoke to journalists and painted a picture of a woman handling a painful situation with grace and maturity. The public, already primed to admire her steadiness, accepted that version without much resistance. Eamonn's silence, by contrast, began to look suspicious. Why wasn't he speaking up? What was he hiding? In the court of public opinion, silence is rarely interpreted as restraint. It is almost always interpreted as guilt. What people did not fully appreciate was that Eamonn's silence was not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It was the silence of a man calculating his odds in an environment where anything he said would be filtered through a lens that had already been shaped without him. He knew that the moment he opened his mouth, every word would be measured against Ruth's composed version of events. He knew that tabloids would pull sentences out of context, that whatever he revealed would be repackaged into whatever story sold best that week. So he waited. And while he waited, the assumptions hardened. The version of events that did not include his perspective became, for many people, simply the truth. But silence is not free. Every day that Eamonn Holmes did not speak, he paid a price. Colleagues who might have supported him kept their distance, unsure of what had really happened and unwilling to risk being wrong. Friends who cared about both parties found themselves in the impossible position of choosing sides without enough information to choose wisely. And the public continued filling the gaps with whatever story felt most satisfying. He was cold, they said. He had checked out years ago. He had probably done something he could not defend, and his silence was proof of it. None of these people knew anything about the reality of what had happened inside that marriage. But certainty rarely waits for facts, especially when one side of a story has been told clearly and the other has not been told at all. What has emerged gradually, through Eamonn's own careful measured comments in various interviews and public appearances since the divorce, is a picture of a marriage that was undermined not by a single dramatic event but by a long, slow process that neither party fully understood while it was happening. At the center of that process was something that began as a straightforward medical reality and evolved into something far more complicated. Eamonn Holmes has been open, in recent years, about his struggles with chronic pain. He has spoken about back problems that became so serious they affected his mobility, his ability to work, his ability to simply move through the world the way he once had. What he has spoken about less, until more recently, is how that physical vulnerability changed the dynamic of his marriage in ways that went far beyond the practical. When a person becomes physically dependent on their partner, the relationship changes. This is not a moral judgment, it is simply a fact about human dynamics. The person who provides care holds a different kind of power than the person who receives it, and that power, even when it is wielded with the best of intentions, reshapes the architecture of a relationship in ways that both people may struggle to name or even recognize. In Eamonn's case, his deteriorating health gave Ruth a degree of control over his daily life that, he has suggested, gradually extended beyond the boundaries of what felt like care and into territory that felt like something else entirely. He has spoken about feeling as though his world was slowly shrinking. Not all at once, not in any way that was easy to point to and say, this, right here, this is the problem. But gradually, steadily, in the way that a room gets smaller when furniture is added one piece at a time. There were decisions being made on his behalf that he had not been consulted on. There were social connections that withered because they required an energy he no longer had, combined with the fact that his access to the outside world was increasingly filtered through Ruth's judgment of what he could and could not handle. There were conversations he was not part of, plans made without him, a version of his own life being managed and administered in ways that left him feeling less like a partner and more like a patient. None of this, on its face, looks like cruelty. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to talk about, and precisely why Eamonn was so cautious about how he eventually chose to frame his experience. When care tips over into control, it does so gradually, and it always has a justification that sounds reasonable. He needs rest. He cannot manage too much stimulation right now. His health means we have to be careful. Every individual decision makes sense in isolation. It is only when you step back and look at the pattern that you begin to see something else. A person whose autonomy has been steadily eroded, who no longer makes choices independently, who has forgotten what it felt like to simply want something and act on it without first calculating whether that want would be allowed. The emotional cost of that kind of existence is enormous. Eamonn Holmes, by his own account, spent years adjusting himself to fit a version of his life that did not really have room for him in it. He stopped expressing opinions that might lead to exhausting arguments he no longer had the energy to sustain. He stopped reaching out to friends who he knew would be viewed as complications. He retreated further and further into a smaller and smaller version of himself. And the tragedy is that this retreat happened so gradually, under cover of such a plausible narrative about illness and care and practical necessity, that it was almost impossible to see it clearly from the inside. One of the things Eamonn has touched on in his post-divorce interviews is the strange particular pain of being discussed as though you are not in the room. When your physical condition becomes the defining fact of your existence in the eyes of your partner, you stop being a whole person and start being a set of needs and limitations to be managed. He described the experience of being talked about, analyzed, assessed, without being genuinely listened to, of offering a perspective and watching it be dismissed, not harshly, but gently, reasonably, in a way that made him feel as though his own judgment about his own life was no longer something anyone took seriously. This is a particular kind of diminishment, one that leaves no obvious bruises, one that is almost impossible to explain to someone who has not experienced it, because from the outside, everything looks like devotion. What changed things, according to what Eamonn has indicated in various public comments, was not a single moment of revelation but a gradual accumulation of small moments that finally reached a tipping point. A conversation overheard that did not match the face being presented to him daily. An interaction that stripped away the performance of care and revealed something cooler, more calculating, beneath it. A dawning recognition that the version of Ruth he thought he knew and the version that existed when he was not watching were not entirely the same person. He has been careful about what exactly he shares, careful not to level specific accusations he cannot fully substantiate, but the implication in his words is consistent. The care he had felt grateful for was not entirely what it appeared to be. And the realization of that, arriving as it did while he was already physically compromised and emotionally isolated, was devastating in a way that very few people who observed their marriage from the outside could have understood. The divorce announcement in May 2023 was issued in the language that all celebrity divorces use: brief, neutral, designed to close down conversation rather than invite it. Both parties wished each other well. Both asked for privacy. The statement said nothing about the years of quiet difficulty that preceded it, nothing about the dynamics that had made the marriage unworkable long before anyone put it into words, nothing about the toll that public performance had taken on two people who had built their professional identity around appearing happy together. It was, as these things always are, a piece of image management rather than a piece of truth. Ruth Langsford's public profile in the aftermath of the divorce remained essentially unchanged. She continued to be admired for her composure, praised for the dignity with which she handled a painful situation, respected as a woman who had given a great deal to a long marriage and was now moving forward without bitterness or drama. Colleagues expressed support. Fans sent encouragement. The narrative of Ruth as the wronged party, or at least the more graceful one, held firm without needing to be explicitly stated. It simply existed as the background against which everything else was interpreted. Eamonn Holmes, meanwhile, was navigating something considerably more difficult. His health remained a genuine and serious challenge. His professional circumstances had changed significantly, with his departure from This Morning in 2021 having already altered his public profile in ways that the divorce only compounded. And he was carrying a version of events that he knew to be true but that he also knew would be difficult for many people to accept, because it ran counter to the story they had already decided on. He has spoken about the loneliness of that position with a rawness that is hard to dismiss. Knowing the truth and being unable to speak it, or more precisely being able to speak it but knowing that it will not be fully believed, is its own particular kind of suffering. When he did begin to speak more openly, he did so with notable care. He did not go to the outlets that would have paid the most for maximum drama. He did not produce a list of grievances or attempt to catalogue Ruth's failures as a partner. Instead, he spoke about his experience in terms that were personal and emotional rather than accusatory, describing what it felt like to lose your sense of self inside a long relationship, to become so absorbed into someone else's version of your life that you lose track of your own. He spoke about the complexity of caring and being cared for, about the way dependency can reshape a person's identity in ways that have nothing to do with love and everything to do with power. He spoke about the specific vulnerability that comes with chronic illness, and how that vulnerability can be exploited, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not, by the person who holds your daily functioning in their hands. These are not easy things to say publicly. They are not the kind of statements that generate uncomplicated sympathy. Many people, predictably, did dismiss what he said as bitterness, as the self-justifying narrative of a man who could not accept his own role in the collapse of his marriage. That reaction was, in some ways, entirely predictable. When a story has been set for long enough, when one version has calcified into accepted truth, the person arriving late with a different account faces an almost impossible task. They are always going to look like they are rewriting history. They are always going to be accused of playing the victim after the fact. The structural unfairness of that situation is real, and Eamonn Holmes has been living inside it since the day the divorce was announced. But there is another reaction, quieter and less dramatic, from people who listened to what he was actually saying rather than filtering it through the story they had already accepted. People who recognized in his description of dependency and control and the slow erosion of selfhood something that rang genuinely true. People who understood that the experience of being cared for in ways that undermine your independence is not a simple experience, not one that translates easily into the language of abuse or wrongdoing, but one that is nonetheless real and damaging and worthy of being spoken about honestly. The broader question that Eamonn Holmes's post-divorce story raises is one that extends well beyond his specific situation. It is a question about how we talk about relationships in public, about whose version of events gets accepted and whose gets dismissed, about the way that strength and competence in a partnership can shade into dominance without anyone fully intending it or recognizing it. It is a question about what happens to people who become ill or vulnerable inside long relationships, and how that vulnerability can be used, consciously or unconsciously, in ways that permanently alter the balance of power between two people. And it is a question about the cost of silence, both the silence that feels protective in the moment and the silence that, over time, allows a version of the truth to set that bears only a partial relationship to what actually happened. Eamonn Holmes spent decades building a public persona around warmth and humor and a particular kind of unpretentious candor. He was the man who said what he thought, who laughed too loud and took up too much space and was unapologetically himself. The irony of his post-divorce situation is that the version of himself he was forced to present in the aftermath of the split was almost exactly the opposite of that. Cautious, measured, calculating every word against how it might be received, aware that the audience was already primed against him. The contrast between who he presents himself as and who he was forced to become in the wake of the divorce is itself a kind of testament to what the experience cost him. What does it mean for a person to finally speak their truth after a long period of strategic silence? It means accepting that not everyone will believe you. It means understanding that the version of events you are offering will be held up against an existing narrative and found, by some people, to be lacking. It means being willing to be called bitter, self-serving, revisionist, and to continue speaking anyway, because the alternative, which is to remain forever inside someone else's story of your own life, is no longer bearable. Eamonn Holmes reached that point. Something shifted in him, some calculation changed, some cost that had previously seemed acceptable became, finally, too high to keep paying. He has not told everything. He has been clear about that in his own way, pulling back from specifics that might invite legal complications or that might cause harm beyond what is necessary for him to simply be understood. But what he has told is enough to complicate the picture significantly. Enough to make it clear that the clean, simple story of Eamonn and Ruth, the one where he was the difficult partner and she was the long-suffering one who eventually ran out of patience, is not the whole truth and never was. The reality, as reality almost always is considerably more layered than that. In the months and years since the divorce, both Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford have been rebuilding their lives separately. Ruth has remained a visible and respected figure in British media, her public profile essentially intact, her reputation as a professional largely undimmed. Eamonn has continued working through his health challenges, appearing on GB News and maintaining a public presence that, while different from his peak this morning years, demonstrates a resilience that some people might not have expected from a man who was, by his own account, in a very difficult place around the time of the split. But the real story of what happens after a long marriage ends is not told through professional appearances and carefully staged public moments. It is told in the quieter work of rebuilding an identity, of remembering who you were before a relationship defined you, of learning to make choices that are simply your own without measuring them against what someone else will think or allow. Eamonn Holmes has spoken about this process with an honesty that, whatever one thinks of the specific claims he has made, carries the unmistakable weight of genuine experience. He sounds like a man who got very lost inside something and is slowly, painfully finding his way back to himself. The marriage of Eamonn Holmes and Ruth Langsford lasted for over 2 decades. It was conducted, in large part, in public, observed by millions of people who felt they knew these two individuals simply because they had watched them together so many times. The end of that marriage has been, in its own way, equally public, though far less comfortable to witness. Because what has emerged in the aftermath is not the tidy narrative of mutual respect and amicable separation that the official statement tried to establish. What has emerged is messier, darker, and far more human than that. It is the story of two imperfect people who built something together, and then watched it come apart under the pressure of illness and power and time, and the particular stress of performing your relationship for an audience that expects it to always look a certain way. Eamonn Holmes finally spoke. And what he had to say did not destroy Ruth Langsford or vindicate himself completely or resolve the questions that remain about who bears more responsibility for what went wrong. What it did was something more modest and, in some ways, more important. It added his voice to a story that had been